场，也感谢我们直播的参与直播各位朋友，今天来参与我们这场论坛的直播。那我们在这边要先说明一下，这场论坛是由台湾绿色公民行动联盟以及台湾气候行动网络研究中心共同主办。那我们在这个论坛里面呢，我们邀请了来自于加拿大的学者，也就是加拿大英属哥伦比亚大学公共政策暨全球事务学院教授拉玛纳博士。那他由加拿大来台湾接受我们的邀请，一同来参与这样的一个论坛。那我们今天在这个论坛里面呢，我们必须要讨论的是，在气候危机中，核电是否有可能作为气候的解方？那目前我们相信，这部分是全球所关心的问题，也是台湾当下的很重视的一个问题。在台湾现在越趋重视气候变迁、气候问题的一个当下，我们政府也提出了2050的净零转型的这样子的一个政策。那在这个政策里面，我们可以看到，虽然在施行的过程当中有很多的不同的意见，那大家在讨论里面不只包含我们如何大家净零，也包含我们在民生或产业用电的各项的选择。那至今我们可以听到，就是我们在这个能源选择里面，核能一直是我们大家持续争论不已的问题。那台湾争论核能政策争论这么多年，那当然我们现在看到，在今年可能有2个变数。第一个就是我们在今年2025年即将要迎来非核家园的这个实现，也就是我们的最后一个核电厂核3厂，它即将在今年除役。但同时我们也看到，台湾因为经济的需求，因为半导体产业的需求，然后呢增加了这个用电的成长，而许多人也在呼喊的是不是我们因为用电成长，我们必须要重新来考虑核能呢？那我们想这个真的在台湾目前是越来越白热化，那我们也看到不同政治的或政党的立场也在这里面争论中。那我们这次呢是希望呢，更希望大家能够多方采取不同的意见。那所以我们邀请了这位学者呢，也是因为他不但对此呢研究多年，在我们所谓的很有权威性的世界核能产业报告，他也担任作者。那再来就是他自己本人也最近在去年出了一本新书，那他的题目呢，我们暂时中文翻译为《核能并非解方：气候变迁时代的原子能之愚》。所以其实我们这位讲者对于这些问题是有长年的观察并且研究，所以我们希望请拉玛纳博士来，可以从科学角度，还有目前最新的能源跟核能政策争议到底有哪些的问题，能够跟大家作为介绍。因为在台湾，我们现在大家很关心氢核能的问题，例如说 SMR 或核融合，它到底在未来的这个气候变迁，或者是我们所向往的 AI 时代里面，它的功用是如何，到底有没有可能被实现？那所以其实即使大家也都知道，我们发起的主办单位，我们向来是反核的立场，但是我们在这场论坛里面，我们谈的并不是反核与否，而是希望大家能够在不同的资讯来源上，能够多去验证是否这些政策或这些我们所说未来乐观的前景，它到底是可实现的、可发展的，还是它其实还是一场我们认为会虚值投资，甚至不应该在这时候赋予过多期望，而是应该更务实的去谈论我们的净零转型、能源转型呢？那我想在台湾政策讨论的时候，我们非常需要这些资讯，所以我们现在非常感谢就是拉玛纳博士来台参与这个论坛，同时我们也邀请2位语坛人。那我们这2位语坛人呢，一位呢是我们的这个台湾气候行动网络研究中心总监赵家伟，还有一位是我们的林敏聪老师，也是台大物理系的特聘教授。那我们等一下就会由我们的这个论坛时间呢，我们等一下会由拉玛纳博士先进行主题演讲。那在主题演讲之后，我们就会请2位语坛人跟我们的博士一起3位在台上语谈。那我们现场呢会开放18种的提问，那也请大家如果有提问的话呢，我们可以扫描这个 QR code， 我们就现场提问。等一下主持人会带面，然后让大家提问可以获得解答。我们线上的朋友也是可以参与线上提问的。那我们的今天简报的下载的 QR code 也在上方，也可以请大家自由的这个参考取用。那今天因为我们是同步口译，我们必须跟大家说明，就是您如果携带了耳机的话，请插在你座位前面孔有这个耳机孔，那请选择第1频道，第1频道是中文，那就可以让大家在论坛的时候可以听到我们的同步的中文口译。好，那我在这边的介绍到此为止。那我们现在等一下来欢迎我们拉玛纳博士来上台演讲，谢谢大家。
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here to share some of my views. The topic of nuclear power, as the title for today's event suggests, is a controversial one. And I'm going to present some background of what nuclear power, how nuclear power is faring globally, talk a little bit about these so-called small modular reactors that are supposed to be the solution to the problems that are confronting nuclear power, and reflect on how nuclear power might or might not be a solution to climate change. So let me start by giving a little bit of an overview of where they are globally with nuclear power. Globally, the nuclear fleet, the fleet of nuclear reactors around the world, there are roughly about 400 of them. They were built mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. And you can see in this image the number of nuclear reactors that were connected to the electricity grids in different countries around the world. This is the global total for each year. And it starts in the 1950s, and you can see two big increases in the 1970s and 1980s. And from the middle of the 1980s, the number of reactors that started being connected decreased sharply. Roughly speaking, that coincided with the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. That's the first year when the number started declining, and since then it has been very, very low compared to the historical maximum. And there are many years when more reactors have been shut down and taken off the grid than reactors being added. So the net result of this pattern of nuclear reactors being shut down or not being constructed at a very fast rate has been that the global fleet of nuclear reactors has stayed more or less constant since the since the 1990s. And more importantly, if you look at the share of how much electricity nuclear power plants around the world contribute to the world's electricity grids, that share has been declining consistently since the mid-1990s. The highest it ever was in 1996, when it contributed 17.5%. And in the last year for which we have data, which is 2023, the 2024 data is yet to come out, that share had declined to just over 9%. So a decline of nearly 15%. During the same period, modern renewables, namely solar and wind and biomass and some geothermal, that has increased very sharply. And as you can see, the lower curve is the share of renewables, which was quite low, about 1% in the mid-1990s. It's nearly 16% as of 2023. And that number is actually a little bit of an underestimate, because there's a lot of renewables which are on rooftop solar and distributed systems which are not connected to the grid. So that contribution is not included here. So in fact, renewables are contributing even more than what this figure shows. So why do we see this trend? The main answer for why nuclear energy has been declining is that nuclear power is just not economically competitive. Reactors cost a lot to build, and the high cost of building nuclear reactors translates to a high cost of electricity. These are some of the numbers for the most recent reactors that are either under construction or just being built. So the first one is a nuclear reactor that was built in France, Flamanville, that cost around $17 billion. Usually because different sources of power produce different amounts of electricity, in general, economists like to look at the cost per unit of generating capacity. So either kilowatts or megawatts, that's how much maximum electricity it can produce at a given time. And you look at it as a proportion of that. And so you can see these are all very high numbers. So the first one is in France, the second one is 2 reactors being built in the United Kingdom, and then the third one is 2 reactors that just got started functioning last year in the United States, in the state of Georgia. And these are all extremely high numbers. We can talk more about why these are so expensive, but I will just say very simply, the reason why nuclear plants are so expensive to build is that a nuclear plant is basically a very complicated way to boil water. That's what it is. The nuclear fission reactions produce heat that is used to convert water into steam, but the fission process is an inherently hazardous one. And to try and control and to make sure that none of the radioactive materials that are produced ever escape out into the biosphere, we have to institute lots of safety features that drive up the cost of a nuclear reactor. So a nuclear reactor is inherently going to be always expensive. Now, if nuclear power were the only way of generating electricity, then you might say this high cost is worth it. But that's no longer the case. Maybe 20 years ago, if we were having the same discussion, we would have to ask whether the high cost of nuclear power is worth it because we are concerned about climate change and we do not want to invest in fossil fuels. But in the last 15-20 years, the cost of renewable energy sources has declined dramatically. So this is a plot made by a company in the United States called Lazard, which is a Wall Street company. And every year, Lazard has been producing a report that calculates the average cost of power from a new plant of these different technologies, whether it is coal or nuclear or gas or renewables, solar, wind, etc. And this is the plot from different years. So you can see how some of those sources of power have become cheaper. In particular, the yellow curve is that for solar power, the large-scale solar power plant, has declined by probably about 90 or close to 90%. And whereas nuclear power has actually been increasing in cost. And I'll explain why that is the case in 1 second. So that's one trend that you should be thinking about. The traditional answer to this, coming from the nuclear industry, used to be that we know that nuclear power plants are expensive to build, but once you build them, they are cheap to operate because they do not require a lot of fuel. A little bit of uranium can produce a lot of electricity, and therefore it's cheap to operate. And so in the long run, you will profit from it. That used to be the argument. That argument proved to be no longer viable in the last approximately 1 decade, a decade or 5 years. What you saw was that just the operating cost of even old nuclear plants, for which the capital cost had been paid off, the loans that had been taken had been paid off, even for all those reactors, just the marginal cost, the extra cost you have to pay to produce each additional unit of electricity was higher than other alternatives. And this has to do partly with the so-called fracking, hydraulic fracturing that used to produce cheap natural gas in the United States, but it also has to do with renewables becoming very cheap. And so many reactors in the United States got shut down during this period. Until about by 2015, 2016, the nuclear industry started involving in a lot of lobbying efforts to have states in the United States and ultimately the federal government subsidize all these nuclear plants. And that's the only reason why the nuclear fleet, many of the nuclear reactors in the United States have not been shut down. Otherwise, many more plants would have been shut down by this time. So at least 5 states came in to subsidize their nuclear reactor fleet, and then subsequently under the Biden administration, the federal government also subsidized that. But this is not just a story in the United States. We see this in other places like Sweden, where the nuclear plants have to operate in a competitive environment. And in all of those places as well, some of these older reactors are being shut down. Going back to new nuclear plants, the reason why we saw the increase in the cost of nuclear power in the last 10 years in the United States has to do with an old established pattern. Nuclear plants around the world have proven to cost more than was initially estimated. So one academic study that I have sort of tried to summarize in that picture on the left looked at about 180 nuclear projects around the world and found that 175 of them had exceeded the initial budget and also the initial timelines. And they all tend to cost more than they initially think, and they tend to take longer to do that. And this was also the case with the most recent nuclear plant in the United States, the Vogtle nuclear reactor. In the case of Vogtle, the final cost was about $37 billion. And that was about 2.5 times, more than 2.5 times, what was estimated when the nuclear reactor construction started about a little over 10 years ago. At that time, it was expected to be $14 billion. Now, that $14 billion itself is not the original cost. When the plan for the project, or when the utilities that originally thought about building reactors were thinking about this during this period of so-called nuclear renaissance, I'll talk about that later, the people who were, the company that was promoting this particular design, the so-called AP1000 design built by Westinghouse, its cost estimates were in the order of $5 to $6 billion. So that $5 to $6 billion went up to $14 billion by the time actually construction started. And then the $14 billion went up to $37 billion. So that's a very typical pattern. And the reason this is important is because much of the discussion today about these so-called small modular reactors are really in the very earliest stage, the $5 to $6 billion stage. So by the time you actually see any of them construction starting, that will be expected to increase, and then when construction happens, you should expect it to increase again. Okay, so this is about sort of the old reactors. Again, the nuclear industry has a talking point about why this historical pattern is no longer relevant. What they say is that this all happened in the past. Now we have a lot of new nuclear reactor designs, and these would not have the problems that we saw with the old reactor designs. Now, this is an interesting idea because, and the reactor designs that they really talk about are the so-called small modular reactors. What small means is that the amount of electricity that they generate is small compared to a large reactor. By definition, a small reactor generates less than 300 megawatts compared to the typically 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts that today's reactors generate. Now, it's small does not mean that it's necessarily physically small. The size of a reactor depends very much on the type of reactor design that we're talking about. And the other thing to note about small is that these are not, it's not really a new feature. if you look at the United States, all of these reactors that were built in the 60s and 70s would all qualify to be small reactors. The same is the story in Canada, in India, in many, many countries. The first nuclear reactors that were built were all small reactors by the definition of a small modular reactor. Now, in the United States, what happened was that these small reactors were initially promoted in the 1960s as serving rural municipalities. The rural areas in the United States did not have as much power demand as some of the more urban areas. And so they would not be able to use a typical 800,000 megawatt of power. And so the nuclear industry said we can make small reactors. So this is an example of one of those reactors in Elk River. And essentially what happened was all of these reactors were shut down well before they operated for their expected lifetime. And the main reason was that the utilities found they were too expensive to operate. The amount of power they was generating was very small, and the costs were not proportionally small. And so most of these reactors were shut down, and you can see that in the earlier plot, many of them would actually, I don't have the numbers here, but most of them were shut down before the 1970s, end of the 1970s. One or two of them stayed on to the 1980s. More generally, if you think about nuclear power plants, there are four basic challenges that even the nuclear industry would admit to. So in 2003, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, their nuclear engineering department put out a famous report on the future of nuclear power, where they highlighted four challenges. One that I have already talked about a lot, which is cost. And they admitted that nuclear power was not economical at that point. But there were three other challenges. The other one, which I briefly mentioned, is the fact that nuclear reactors can have catastrophic accidents. So accidents were the second challenge. The third was the fact that nuclear power plants produce radioactive waste, for which we don't have a proven demonstrated solution. And the last is the relationship between the technology that generates nuclear power and the technology that is used to make nuclear weapons materials in particular. They are all four challenges that we saw. And if you look at all these small modular reactor designs, what you find is that there are a very large variety of designs, and these designs can help with one or two of these problems, but they do so by making other problems worse. So if you have a reactor that tries to produce less radioactive waste, then you necessarily have to use what is called the fast spectrum, where the fast neutrons are used. And in a fast spectrum reactor, the risk of certain kinds of accidents becomes higher. And I will talk about that later. And so you always have these kind of trade-offs. So no individual nuclear reactor design, SMR or large, will actually address and solve all of these four problems at the same time. In particular, if you think about small modular reactors, they are, I think I mixed up the order, I'll just come back to that. So the smaller reactors will necessarily be more expensive per unit of generation capacity compared to large reactors. This is, for example, this is the reason why many of the small reactors that were built in the United States in the first decade, in the first period of the nuclear age, all got shut down. Right? So, in general, in mathematical terms, the engineers have long known that the cost of a particular facility is proportional to the capacity raised to some power, which is usually called 0.6, and that's what tells you that the cost of a smaller facility typically tends to be large. And this is true for not just nuclear plants, but all kinds of other facilities. And And also for things like, so imagine that you're going from, place from here to let's say to Vancouver, where I come from. Okay? So if all of you have to travel from here, you can all hire individual planes and fly, or you can get on one large airplane and fly. And the large airplane will always be cheaper compared to individual flights, right? So it's the same principle here as well. And because smaller reactors are less efficient, they will also require more uranium per unit of electricity produced, and they will produce more waste per unit of electricity produced. And that's just a feature of the fact that you have a smaller reactor, which means more of the neutrons will escape out of the reactor. It's just a physical principle. The other thing so in response to this, what the nuclear industry will typically say is we know smaller reactors are going to be more expensive, but we can make up for it by manufacturing them in large quantities. This is the modular part of the small modular reactors. One of the modular parts of that. But if you look historically at the nuclear industry, the costs of nuclear plants have gone up with time, not come down. So these the two graphs on the top, the blue points and the green points, show the cost of nuclear power plants in the two countries that have built the most nuclear power plants, which is the United States and France. And in both countries, historically, the costs of nuclear power have increased with time. And if you look at the latest plants that have been built in both the United States and France, they are even more expensive than this plot. Okay? So that trend has continued, has not stopped. Okay? And the second point is, even if you were to think that there is going to be some kind of positive learning effect, the number of small modular reactors you would have to build to try and compensate for the diseconomies of scale is extremely large. Okay? And this is only so that a small reactor can produce power, electricity, at the same cost as a large reactor. Okay? And I already told you, large reactors are themselves not economical. So a small reactor will almost never be as cheap as renewables. So the probability of that is extremely low. And we see the illustrations of how expensive some of these plants are, small reactors are, from just the cost estimates that different SMR vendors are making for their own nuclear plants. And remember, these are just cost estimates. They are very likely to become higher. And this is something which we saw in the last of these, the so-called NuScale reactor design. That's the most advanced reactor design, small modular reactor design in the United States. It has gone through the licensing process at the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and one version of the design was approved with some conditions. And if you look at that particular design, there was a plan to build this design, the small modular reactor design for NuScale, by a particular group of municipal utilities, small utilities, called the Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems. And this is kind of the history of that particular project. All I want you to sort of think about is that the cost of the project kept increasing. So in 2018, the cost estimate was about $4.3 billion. That went up to $6.1 billion in 2020, and then a number of the municipalities that are part of UAMPS stepped away from that agreement. They said, we're not interested anymore. And then the designer said, okay, we're going to make actually a smaller project, only 462 megawatts. And then at that time, the cost estimate jumped up to $9.3 billion. So following that, later that year, the entire project was terminated. And here's an illustration of how the cost increased with time in terms of both the total cost and the per kilowatt cost. And what is most important to note is that the last figure, the $9.3 billion, if you look at it as a per kilowatt, per unit of capacity cost estimate, that's about 250% of the initial cost estimate of the Vogel project, of the AP1000 project that was built, and which I told you had a cost overrun of about 2.5 times. So it's an extremely expensive venture when you think about it in per unit of electricity terms. The other thing that we have seen with regard to small modular reactor designs around the world has been that the time periods that that companies are talking about for how long it would take to deploy these reactors has also increased at each of these different stages. I don't want to go through all of this except to say that this is a pattern we are seeing in multiple countries. The last thing I will say about these so-called small modular reactors is that if indeed we are going to have these small modular reactors manufactured in large quantities in factories, there is a potential problem that would result in case we deploy these, we meaning the world at large, deploys these nuclear reactor designs and finds out later on that there is a problem, right? So we saw this, for example, in the case of Boeing aircraft. We've seen this in the case of cars, like the Toyota had a stuck pedal problem and things of that sort. In all of those cases, when we discover a problem, you can take back those machines, whether it's a car or a plane, go back to the factory, fix the problem, and then send it back. How do you do that with a nuclear reactor that has a radioactive core? Right? How do you take this back to a factory? So this is a problem that the nuclear industry really has no answer for. Okay, I'll say a little bit more about nuclear, these small modular reactors, which are also sometimes called advanced reactors and so on. And again, the argument from the nuclear industry is that the designs which have had problems are mostly what are called light water reactor designs. And there are other designs which can actually address these problems. But again, we have to look to history to see how these have fared in the past. Because no nuclear reactor design is completely new. In the 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of different designs that were explored by atomic energy establishments around the world, and there are a lot of designs which are in the textbooks in nuclear engineering. So when today we hear about new designs, most of these designs they take some of the old designs and then they make some changes, right? So maybe you use a new alloy, maybe you use a new design for the steam generator, things of that sort. But ultimately these are all old designs, and the old designs were not adopted because they had problems. So for one example is the so-called high temperature gas-cooled reactors. So the attraction for this kind of design is that they operate at a higher temperature, which means that the output of the heat can come at a much higher temperature, which makes for both more efficient conversion to electricity, but also the possibility that heat can be used directly in industries which require high temperature heat. Right? The problem is that, again, the history of these reactors has not been very promising. Right? So those references there sort of show how I've sort of talked in much more detail about what these problems are. I'll give just one example here, which is the reactor that was built in the United States in the state of Colorado called Fort St. Vrain. And the Fort St. Vrain was promoted as a very safe reactor. And it operated for about 14 years, but during that period, it produced only a very small fraction of the electricity that it produced. So on average, it produced maybe about 15% of the total power that it was expected to produce. Okay? And then ultimately, the utility just decided to shut it down. And the New York Times carried this headline, which says, "The world's safest reactor is closing down because it rarely runs," showing how poorly the operating record has been. Similarly, the other kind of reactors that we hear a lot about are the so-called sodium-cooled fast reactors. This is the design that Bill Gates is promoting through his natrium reactor design, the company that he started. But again, sodium-cooled reactors have a long history, and much of the problems have to do with the use of this material sodium, which most of you might know from your high school chemistry and physics is a very difficult material to deal with. It does not react very well with air, with water. These are the most common substances in the world, right? And so what we find is that many of these reactors have been shut down. They have had small accidents which have been very expensive to deal with. And in particular, all reactors which have been operated so far have had a history of leakages of sodium, which have to do with certain chemical properties. And the other challenge with these sodium-cooled reactors, fast reactors, is that they are susceptible to a certain kind of accident which we do not see in light water reactors, called a core disassembly accident. Which just means, it's a very fancy term, which just means that unlike in light water reactors, when an accident starts in a light water reactor, the reactivity, the amount of energy that it can produce actually goes down when the reactor core changes position. In a sodium-cooled fast reactor, when the reactor core starts changing position, it can increase the amount of reactivity, which means it can produce more and more energy, leading to a possible explosion. It's a small explosion, it's not like a nuclear weapons explosion, but it's still an explosion that can breach any containment that is there. Now, why do I mention all of these things? It's because many of these properties are fundamental to the nature of the design. It has to do with the chemistry and the physics of the design, right? It does not matter that this reactor design is being promoted by one of the world's billionaires, Bill Gates. The physics and the chemistry is still going to be affecting those, right? So that's, I think, something which is central. And the last reactor design which people talk about sometimes is so-called molten salt reactors. Again, the history has been very poor. This is why the United States, the Atomic Energy Commission, actually gave up on even trying to commercialize this design way back in the 1970s. They did build one test reactor in a place called Oak Ridge, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and it operated from 1965 to 1969, during which period it was repeatedly shut down. And the waste from this very small reactor that operated for just a few years has been incredibly hard to deal with. Till date, they are spending about $10 million for just dealing with the waste. They still have not found a permanent repository. The challenge with this has to do with the fact that these molten salts that are used are very corrosive. They are very difficult to deal with. And so the wastes are also naturally very difficult to deal with. So all of these so-called new reactor designs have various problems. And so you cannot expect them to solve the problems that are confronting nuclear power. Now, I'm going to change directions a little bit to talk about the challenges of sort of nuclear power in an era of climate change, where we are seeing a rapid increase in renewables. I already showed to you how the global fraction of renewables has been increasing consistently. And the same thing is also true for the investment patterns. So from the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, this is the sort of trend in global investment decisions in new renewables, and you compare that with nuclear power. That's the low purple line in the bottom. And so globally, we are seeing a rapid increase in renewables. Now, the challenge with renewables, as many of you know, is that renewables do not produce a steady amount of electricity. The output of the renewables, whether it's solar or wind, typically it varies a lot. There are renewable sources like geothermal, which could produce a relatively stable output, but that's a much smaller fraction of renewables. That's not anywhere near as cheap as solar and wind. So we have to think about how do we deal with the variability of these renewables. This is not an unusual problem, because electricity grids historically were developed precisely to deal with the variability of any power plant. All power plants have to be shut down for some time. For a nuclear plant, for example, you might have to shut it down to do the refueling or to do some maintenance. Or in the event that there is a failure of some component, you may have to replace the component. So at that time, the nuclear plant will be producing zero power, right? Same is true with coal plants, same is true with natural gas plants. All plants will have times when they are going to be producing power, zero amount of power. And so this is the reason why around the world we have electricity grids, so that you can try to balance the variability of individual plants by having something, by having multiple different sources, right? And that is true for renewables as well. So if you have a diverse set of renewables, so solar photovoltaics, possibly solar concentrated thermal, onshore wind, offshore wind, small hydro, geothermal, all of those things, having multiple sources will necessarily allow you to smooth out some of the variations in the outputs. The second way by which you can try to deal with it is to change whether there are ways by which the demand side can also be altered. So for example, in the United States these days, there is a lot of talk about so-called virtual power plants, where the idea is that individual consumer demand is aggregated by companies who will then offer that as a service to the utility by saying, if you want at some point for all of my customers to lower their demand by, let's say, by increasing the temperature of their air conditioners during a hot summer day, or by turning off their dishwashers or something of that sort, then that is another way by which you can modify the demand to suit better the supply of the electricity. And the last, but sort of the most obvious way to deal with this is to add storage, whether it's in the form of batteries. Lithium-ion batteries in particular have become very cheap, but also a whole range of other technologies that are under development. We don't know right now which of these technologies are going to be the best suited in, let's say, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That's a very fast evolving space. I don't think we can have confidence in saying this is the technology that is going to lead in that particular fashion. But given the wide variety of R&D efforts in the storage field, we can be sure that there's going to be a lot of progress in that space. So between these three different sets of solutions, I think the variability of renewables can be dealt with quite effectively. But the one way that you probably do not want to deal with is to use nuclear power as a way to deal with the variability. And the reason has to do with the fact that when you try to use, there are some technical challenges with using nuclear plants to be able to go up and down, but let's not talk about that. The more important challenge for them is that when nuclear power is already very expensive, if you use it as a way to back up renewables, then you necessarily will produce much less power than if you were trying to use the nuclear plant to produce a flat output, the so-called baseload pattern of use. In reality, once you have a lot of renewables in the grid, no plant will be operating in a baseload fashion if the decisions are made in an economically rational fashion. And the reason is that renewables have essentially a zero marginal cost of production. Right? Once you set up your solar panel, once you set up wind turbine, there's no cost for the fuel. There's only a little bit of maintenance cost. So whenever these are producing power, it's economically rational to use the power from the solar and the wind and so on. And so it makes sense to shut down everything else on the grid if the demand is met by renewables. And we see this happening in many places in the world. For example, in California, where renewables are already producing on certain days at certain times, essentially more than 100% of the demand. And the extra power has been going in to charge batteries, which then start producing power during the evening time when the solar panels no longer generate power. So this is definitely a possibility. We also see in the case of Germany, which has phased out nuclear power. Their phase-out law goes back to the year 2000, when for the first time the Green Party and the Social Democrats came together. And anyway, so the point which I want to make is that by 2010, when the reactors started being shut down, and you look at how their electricity sector has evolved over this period, the amount of terawatt hours, the energy generated by the nuclear plants in 2010, how much was reduced by 2023, and has been more than compensated by the amount of energy that their renewable sector has produced. Right? So it's not true that nuclear power has been replaced by fossil fuels. In fact, Germany's use of fossil fuels has also declined, especially in the electricity sector. Right? So it is possible to do both. It's not to say that it's easy, but it is something which can be doable. So there's something which is a visible proof of that. And key to it also is whether we can try to improve the efficiency of energy systems used. I won't sort of spend much more time on that, but I'll just sort of go towards the end by raising the question that I try to answer in my book. Should we expand nuclear power to solve climate change? So one set of arguments that I have made is that it's not going to be very feasible to use nuclear power to solve climate change. One reason being that it is a very expensive way to generate power. Right? I've already explained that in great detail. But the other thing to remember about nuclear power is that it takes a long time to build nuclear plants, and we don't have that kind of time. Right? Climate scientists tell us that we should be reducing emissions extremely fast. We are reaching all of the dates, all of the targets that have been set by the IPCC and so on and so forth, unfortunately. But trying to say let's deal with this with nuclear power makes even less sense, given that building a nuclear plant takes a very long time. The average nuclear plant takes roughly about 10 years to go from when you start pouring concrete into the ground, which is usually the point at which we say a reactor starts construction, to the point where it starts generating electricity and supplying it to the grid. Right? But no nuclear plant can be built immediately. Right? And I also say that 10 is just an average number. There are many, many places where it has taken very long, even much longer periods of time. So this picture here is of a nuclear reactor that's being built in southern India, closest to where I grew up, the city of Madras. And at that time, when the construction of this reactor, this is one of those fast breeder reactors that I mentioned, when the construction of this reactor started, they said it was going to be built in 6 years. Right? It's now 2025, it's still not operating. Okay? So that's a sort of typical example of how this can be fantastically wrong in many cases. But the more important point also is that even the start of construction cannot happen overnight. So where I live right now in Vancouver, in British Columbia, in Canada, my province does not have any nuclear plants. In the last election there, which ended last year, one of the parties, the Conservative Party there, said we should consider building nuclear plants. Right? So let's say they had won. They didn't win, but let's say they had won and they decided they were going to build nuclear plants in British Columbia. British Columbia will still have to go through all of the processes, the safety review processes, the environmental assessments, finding a community of people who are willing to live near this nuclear plant. Right? Ultimately, the lesson that we learned from Chernobyl, from Fukushima, all of the accidents, is that the communities that are most affected by these nuclear accidents are the ones that live closest to them. Some of those communities had to leave and can never come back to their houses. This is the case in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Right? Even though it is now close to 40 years since the accident, the levels of radiation are still so high that nobody can move back. So people who have to leave their houses where they have grown up and never go back to that place. So that's a very hard ask of any community. So it is quite natural that when nuclear plants are proposed in many places, there is a lot of opposition, right? This would be the case in British Columbia too, right? So you have to find a community, and usually the only way by which this is happening is by bribing them, right? By telling them, oh, you know, you're going to get all these jobs, you're going to get a lot of money, etc., etc. But it's a long process. And last but not least, if they had to build one in British Columbia, they would have to raise the tens of millions of dollars it costs to build this nuclear plant. All of that is going to take a lot of time. It can take 5, 10 years, right? So if BC had decided to build a nuclear plant, it would be the 2040s before BC actually saw any electricity coming out of a new nuclear plant, right? That's really not the timeline that we see. Okay? On paper, we will see all of these claims that, oh, we can build this in 3 years, 5 years, and we saw this, for example, with the Vogtle plant in the United States, where Westinghouse, for a period, used to have a nice computer simulation on their website, which will show like 1, 2, 3, 4, like 36 months, you know, different blocks coming together, sort of like Lego blocks, and then suddenly, there's like magically, the reactor gets built in 3 years. In actual fact, it took more than 3 years. I mean, 3 times that. Okay. And so what happens on the computer does not work in the real world. That's something which we should sort of remember, right? And we see this also in large-scale plants. So in the United States, the Vogtle reactor was something that was built on the basis of the discussion about something called a nuclear renaissance. So this was in the first decade of this century, and the George Bush administration at that time passed in 2005 something called the Energy Policy Act that gave a lot of incentives to electric utilities to build nuclear plants. And so many of these utilities then said, yes, we're going to build nuclear plants. And there were about 30 reactors that were ordered around the country, right? Of which about 15 of them were expected to come online by 2021. Right? In fact, what happened was only 4 of those reactors actually went to the point when they started construction. Most of them, when they looked at how high the cost was, they just canceled the idea. Of course, they all spent a bunch of money doing those plans, and that money was completely wasted. Of the 4 reactors that started, 2 of them were in the state of South Carolina, where the reactor construction became more and more expensive. It was taking longer and longer. And then the company that was the owner of the design, which also got involved in that particular construction in South Carolina, Westinghouse Corporation, in 2017 went under bankruptcy protection. Right? This is when basically South Carolina project was abandoned after about $9 billion was spent. Now, the 2 states that I mentioned, South Carolina and Georgia, where the reactors actually went into construction, were both states where the state legislatures passed legislation that allowed the utility companies to charge customers even during the process of construction. So well before they start getting any electricity from these reactors, consumers started paying money to the utility for this. Okay? And in the state of South Carolina, they spent several $billion. Some of it is to the investors, some of them goes to the customers. They spent over $9 billion for electricity that they never saw, right? So that's the only way. So the only projects that survived was the Georgia project, the Vogtle project that I mentioned, which cost $37 billion. Okay? So it's a pretty remarkable story about a nuclear renaissance that was supposed to build all these new nuclear plants, which just didn't happen. Right? And this is not just the United States. We see the same story in the UK. Okay? Again, in the UK, there was a lot of talk about 8, 10 nuclear reactors by 2020, and then the one reactor design, one reactor project that went forward, the so-called Hinkley Point, it was promised to start operating in 2017. Okay? And the head of the company that was building it said, by Christmas of 2017, people will be will be producing their Christmas turkey by using electric power from this Hinkley Point. Right? It's now estimated that maybe it will start operating in 2029. and the cost has sort of gone enormously. Right? What's the bottom line here? The bottom line is when we are thinking about climate change, we can't think only about whether something is a low carbon source of electricity or not. We also have to think about how costly it is, because we only have a finite amount of money that we have to decide, and how long it takes. So by investing in nuclear, you're spending more money to produce possible emission reductions, assuming that the plant actually gets constructed, right? In a period of 15, 20 years from now, as opposed to something which can produce emission reductions at a lower cost for in a quicker manner with renewables. Right? So that's the choice you have to think about. The other thing to think about in the context of climate change is whether it is desirable. Is this a way you would like to solve? And I mean, I sort of very quickly say there are three kinds of reasons why we think, I think nuclear power is not a desirable way to deal with climate change. The first is that nuclear reactors are capable of severe accidents. There are sort of theoretical reasons why nuclear reactors are capable of accidents, having to do with the fact that they are complex technologies, which means that many failures can happen. They contain large amounts of radioactive materials, which are hazardous to human health. They operate at high temperatures, sometimes some of them operate at high pressures, and in general, large amounts of energy release are possible. And things happen very, very quickly. So if you look at any real accident, like in Chernobyl or whatever, the amount of time between when the operators get the first warning that something is going wrong to the point when the accident fully happens, when there's an explosion or something of the sort, is extremely short, 1-2 minutes. Really not enough time for you to take any kind of action there. Right? The second, because of the complexity, it is not possible to actually think about all possible accident modes. Right? You can only say, I know this particular accident mode, we know what happened in Fukushima, you can try to prevent that kind of accident from happening again by adding new cooling sources, etc., etc. But the history of accidents shows that reactor accidents happen in ways that were not anticipated earlier. Right? Every major accident happens in a different way. And this is something that was pointed out by a sociologist called Charles Perrow way back in the 1980s, studying the first major well-known accident, which is 3 Mile Island. And the other point about these accidents is that the cost of cleaning up can be enormous. Right? We know that from the case of Fukushima. And the other thing to remember is that all of this involves institutions that have lots of other challenges. Right? There's a lot of overconfidence in many of what these people say. Regulators can fail. There can be governmental pressures to start operating these reactors quickly, which is not conducive to safety. So in the real world, if you think about it, the probability of an accident in any nuclear power plant, whether they are small or large, is uncertain. We never know what the actual probability is, but we can be sure it's greater than zero. There's no such thing as a safe nuclear plant. If by safe you mean that there is no possibility of radioactive materials escaping from the reactor and surrounding. A second challenge, which I kind of mentioned, this is more as a global issue to think about. If you want to think about nuclear power as a solution to climate change, it is not just a handful of countries that can build these nuclear plants. It has to be built around the world in multiple countries, especially in the so-called developing world, where demands for electricity are increasing tremendously. Right? So you have to see, Indonesia and Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and all of these countries building nuclear plants, in which case we have to ask the question, how many of these countries might choose to use the technology to make nuclear energy to also develop nuclear weapons? And that's a different security problem, but the two of them are linked. Right? And the challenge is that nuclear energy production involves the use of these materials, enriched uranium and plutonium, which can be used to make nuclear weapons as well. And even a small nuclear plant will actually have a large amount of requirement, or will produce large amounts of plutonium that can be used to make several nuclear weapons, even a small plant. By small, I mean in terms of electricity capacity. if you really have to think about using nuclear power to deal with climate change, you have to build thousands of these plants, right? And so the amount of material that's going to be flowing around of plutonium, of enriched uranium is enormous. And we have to really think, can we escape nuclear war? And the last challenge has to do with the radioactive waste that you produce. As I mentioned, production of radioactive materials is an inherent part of generating nuclear power because the fission reactions will always produce these wastes. The question is, what is the nature of these wastes? Some of these radioactive materials that are produced inside a nuclear plant are things we have never seen in human history, right? Because these were produced for the first time after 1945. And some of these materials are going to be hazardous. They're going to remain radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay? So the plot here is of what is the toxicity of radiotoxicity of if you ingest some of this material somehow by mixture into your food or into your water, what kind of toxicity it lasts and how does it compare with just having uranium in the background, and you see that it runs to about 100,000 to a million years. Right? That's the kind of time scale we're talking about. And at this kind of a time scale, we really don't have any confidence that you can predict how the proposed solutions will deal with it. So around the world, what have nuclear establishments done about the radioactive waste? They basically have one solution, which is you dig a deep hole somewhere and you bury it there. Okay? They will not call it a deep hole, they will call it a geological repository, but that's the same idea. Right? And can you actually know how this particular rock, how this particular tunnel that you sort of dug there, how the materials that you have placed in there are going to behave for 10,000 years, or 100,000 years? What's the kind of confidence you can have? And the answer is not a lot, right? These people are working extremely hard, they do a lot of modeling, but there are always going to be uncertainties. And the uncertainties become amplified the further you go out into time. And so there is no demonstrated solution. And also the record we have of a couple of repositories that have been built, one in Germany, one in the United States, to deal with sort of the radioactive waste from the nuclear weapons production process, the so-called waste isolation pilot plant, have all behaved in ways that were not expected. So in the case of the waste isolation pilot plant in the United States, there was a major explosion in 2014 involving a cask that had plutonium inside it. Okay? This was not anticipated in any of their safety assessments, right? Because somebody had changed the kind of material that was used to pack some of the plutonium in that. Okay? And if you cannot predict an accident that is going to happen in 15 years, what confidence will you have about 10,000 years? And that's the question you have to be asking yourself. Okay, I'll sort of wind down by just saying there's one new development that has come up in the last few months, which people have been talking about a lot, which is the role of big tech, right? So we saw in 2024 statements from both all the big companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft and so on, saying they're going to invest in nuclear power, in particular small modular reactors. Okay? And that has made a lot of people very excited, right? There are sort of multiple things I can say. I can give a whole talk about what's happening there, but I'll say very briefly just a couple of points. The first is that the primary motivation for these companies has nothing to do with any love for nuclear power or even any kind of objective assessment that that is the best way to deal with nuclear problems. Their challenge is primarily one of public relations. Most of these companies have seen what happened to the earlier round of cryptocurrency companies that had a lot of negative publicity, negative media coverage about how much energy they were using, how much emissions they were making, to the point that various countries started legislating rules about how this data, the crypto mining happens. So in the United States, for example, the Biden administration had some executive order where they talked about it. All of these large companies, when they see their data centers being used for AI and so on, they know that that's the kind of media attention they might get. they're already getting a little bit of that because their emissions have been increasing, right? And so this, talking about nuclear power, is just a nice way to deflect attention, right? It is like the magician's trick, where you kind of do something here, but actually with this other hand you're doing something else, right? And what these companies are doing is right now using more and more fossil fuels, and their emissions are going up, right? So that's, I think, the reality, that it is mostly a way by which these companies are using all of the publicity, the propaganda that the nuclear industry has made over the last decade or 2 decades to say it's a clean and green and solution to climate change. To say, okay, we can also take advantage of that publicity by using the same thing. The second thing to note is that all of these companies, the contracts that they have signed are not public. We don't know what is actually inside those contracts. I'm absolutely sure that Google and Amazon have very smart physicists and engineers who know exactly how long it is going to take, how much it costs to build a nuclear plant, etc. Right? What do we know about these contracts are the amounts they are claiming to invest or plan to invest are very small compared to what you take to build a nuclear plant. So the one company that has made some numbers is Amazon. I think it's of the order of $300 to $500 million is the kind of number they're talking about. Now, to put that in perspective, remember I mentioned this small modular reactor design called NuScale. Okay? NuScale it's not started construction so far, but it is the reactor design that is furthest along in the regulatory process. So far, NuScale has spent over $1.8 billion on just research and development. Okay? None of these companies are spending anywhere near that. Okay? On just R&D, let alone actual construction. Okay? The actual construction, as I said, the cost estimate for the first plant was $9.3 billion. So you would have to think about these companies should be investing something on the order of $10–20 billion if they are serious about nuclear power. Right? $10–20 billion is not a lot of money for Amazon or Google or any of these companies, but they're not doing that. They are investing a few $100 million, which is, as far as they are concerned, how much I spend on coffee. It's the equivalent of that. It's very cheap for them. Right? They spend that and they get some public relations benefits, and it makes no difference to their emissions. Right? It's just wonderful talk saying, oh, sometime in the 2030s. The problem is that the demand is happening today, right, in the next few years. And we don't even know whether by 2030 there will be a big increase in demand because of AI, because the AI business model is still not very clear whether it's going to work or not. That's a big question. I'll just say that there are uncertainties about that as well. But this is all just PR work most of the time, just hyping up something, which the nuclear industry is very happy because they are under very difficult circumstances as well. So there's a kind of mutual benefit from the between the nuclear industry and big tech. But from the viewpoint of consumers, from the viewpoint of citizens, none of this makes any sense. It's not something that we should be supporting. So I'll end up by just saying, just reiterating that nuclear power is an expensive way, it cannot be scaled up quickly, and therefore it's not a feasible way to climate change. It poses a number of risks. And just a minor point that most of the time these risks are not going to be faced by the owners of Google or Amazon. Right? It is not happening in Seattle. It's not being set up in Mountain View. These reactors, the uranium mines that fuel it, the waste facilities that are going to be built to deal with this are all going to be upon sort of disempowered, poorer communities within the United States or Canada or in Taiwan. Right? And so just want to say that we have to think a little bit also about the inequities that are inherent in this process. Thank you very much. Sorry I ran over time.
我们谢谢拉玛纳博士精彩的演讲哦。那我们接下来就进行到我们的语谈时间，我们邀请我们2位语谈的贵宾一起上台。好，那我们今天有2位语谈人哦。那我们先邀请我们台大物理系的林敏聪教授来参与语谈。
是在成本方面的非常清楚的知识，我就不再重复了。那怎么来说？我其实非常谢谢台湾气候行动联盟跟我们很多的 NGO engage 到这个部分去讨论台湾的核去核从。如果我们回想一下，大概2011年福岛开始那时候发生的时候，其实制造一个世界的氛围，所以那时候其实台湾的讨论并没有像今天这么深入。我们等于是在补我们2011年来到2014整个废掉核四以后，我们今天应该做的这个科学的工作，或者是社会沟通的工作。所以我整个来觉得，我是觉得还蛮正面。那你可以看出来，同样的问题当时没有回答的，今天也不断提出来，当做是支持核四，支持新的这个核能本身的一个方向的理由。我底下会讲。那所以我底下的引言呢，我会聚焦在整个公共政策对于台湾核能要做一些决定，它的一些关键问题，就是我们在2011年来这个重要的关键问题是哪些？那我们知道，这个社会对于整个公共政策的理性评估，或者是所谓的科学评估，科学必须要被很仔细的定义。还有决策，在一个民主国家，它当然是取决于非常重要的公民是否它的核心价值。那这是第一个。那这个核心价值在今天的沟通跟在2011年的沟通，我相信会非常不一样。我们真正回到民国70年代，在兰屿设立非常初阶的这个核废料，那时候根本没有沟通，那时候还用骗。这个事情当然今天不可能在这边产生，或者不会用那个时候的粗糙的方式产生，现在会用不同的方式来产生，我们应该更精确讲这样。所以今天我们要面对的是这个知识背后那个是否足够完整到能够回答我们关心的议题。所以我底下会提出一个，不只是完全相信专家，今天有很多的 data 出来。那我知道最近其实商周刊也出了一系列，大概有7篇专文，包括孔子前的专访，里面也提出很多问题。那我们只看结论，结论好像都不一样。他的结论是核能是未来台湾的非常重要的救星，但是他也 bypass 很多问题，这边没有办法有时间一一的讲他 bypass 哪些问题，但我会提出一些关键的问题，是我们共同要去面对。不管你是永核，或者是你反对核能作为台湾的重要的一个方向，你都必须要去面对。所以我面对的关键问题，除了所谓的科技或者所谓的公共知识之外，公共知识包含你这些知识必须要让人家理解，这是今天我想这场演讲非常重要的目的，把很多的知识跟事实让各位来判断，让这个社会来判断。那科技知识也许是普遍，这个东西是应该越透明越好。当他讲核能是可能的时候，我们就要进去看看核能有什么样的问题。他不能只讲核能的好处，核能的坏处都不讲。说核能很便宜，其实核能很多的外部成本都不加进去。核能在美国很好，说不定在台湾不见得好。那这样子是必须要去 debate， 必须要去辩论。那科技知识这些东西可以透过透明，可以透过讨论，所以它是一定程度是普遍，它一定是理性。但是也不要忘记，科技本身的应用，它却是相当的社会性。也就是说，在台湾甚至相当的地域性。台湾有台湾的地域条件，台湾的社会条件，台湾的还作为一个海岛本身的先天的大自然的条件，在这样的一个地域条件之下，台湾如果去面对一个科技的应用，我们的应用方式是不是美国某些方式好像可以？我说好像，他们事实上在国内有很多 debate， 那台湾就可以直接转移到台湾使用。我想这个是非常重要的一点，也就是说，你必须回答地域问题。这个地域是 local 的问题，就是就台湾，所以我底下的问题会针对刚刚的一般性的科技问题。回过头来，我们问自己：今天在台湾，如果这个科技在台湾使用的话，我们会遇到什么样的问题？那我觉得任何支持核能的 他都必须要回答这个问题。有责任的，我讲是有责任。如果你是没有责任的，当然就不会回答这样的问题，就会躲掉这样的问题。所以最近有一句反核 （back to nuclear power）， 这个反回去的反，它只是回到过去没有解决的问题，它并没有提出新的解决方案。那它背后的真正的 motivation， 背后的真正的思维，我底下会在我的小节里面做一个回应啊，这是嘉伟给我的题目，就是说你针对台湾产业界，特别是电子业，为什么对这些东西抱持着主动支持态度 ？OK， 好，什么是关键问题？我很快，第一个是核废料的永久储存的问题。我刚刚 Google 一下，其实大家就常常讲，芬兰已经有了，为什么台湾不能有？因为芬兰的地质条件跟台湾地质条件不一样。对，芬兰然后另外一个核废料你要放在哪里？就在一个民主治理里面，大家还知道不知道？事实上是台电本身的 transformer， transformer 叫做什么？不是它的变所，变电站，它在台北都没有办法成立，因为地区有反对。那同样核废料的是永久储存的问题，我们到现在都还放在这个核市场，核能厂里面，不是核市场，就核一、核二、核三里面。那你如果解决这个问题，地方的政府他愿意帮忙解决这个问题吗？那解决这个问题，我们如何一样兼顾所谓的正义的问题？谁能够来决定要放在我这里？刚刚其实也有谈，我先不谈新的这个核能发电厂要放在哪，我们就既有的问题，你必须提出解决方案。那这个方案其实从来没有在支持核能的这个部分，这次重提的这个方案里面被仔细的讨论，被正面面对。那也就是说，我们在2011年那时候没有回答的问题，今年还是没有办法回答。2011年那个时候反对造成我们停止核试的问题，今天还是没有反对，今天还是没有回答，还是没有正面回答。第三个，risk 的后果，刚刚其实有谈，这个 risk 在美国 risk 的 impact， 它的 consequence， 跟在台湾产生就是有核灾害的 risk， 甚至比起在日本，台湾的 risk 的 impact 实际上比其他地方大很多。我简单这样讲，在2011年福岛产生之后，台湾还是有同样一群人支持核能的人，他同样一群人在希望禁止福岛附近的核能的农产品进到台湾，你不觉得很荒谬的事情吗？对不对？如果我们有同样的这么强的对核能本身的拥抱，那你是不是应该同时可以拥抱一下？证明说，如果发生了核灾，这个日本核能发电厂，核能附近的这个农产品，现的农产品，我们事实上同样也可以接受。所以这个是 inconsistent， 就是 inconsistent。那台湾的 risk 的后果当然会远比日本严重很多，因为台湾如果发生在我想说发生在我们讲说金山万里那个地方，大概30公里、40公里就到台北，稍微再多一点就到我们的地堡。那它的 impact， 台湾本身的因为地区非常狭窄，如果你影响到出口，那这个对台湾的经济发展事实上是相当大，影响是相当大。那这个不是核能本身的灾害本身的 damage 而已，它影响是整个你在做你的所有的 export 这个部分的包含就是我们的真正的输出安全的输产区而已，而且包含你的整个出口，你的货物出口，你的影响是相当大。那所以它的 consequence 有点类似像你发生以后，你的 impact 相当大，大概从北台湾或者是大概是北台湾从新竹以北这部分的影响，会影响到整个你在经济上的这个出口。那在这个地方，它的发生的几率当然是很低。我稍微说一下，因为这边介绍我是物理学家，物理学家创造了一个数学家，也不是数学家创造叫 delta function。什么叫 delta function？ 它好像就在发生的几率非常低，但只要发生了，它的影响非常大，所以它加起来，它可能就 total， 也就是说你损害就损害完全。 我简单举个例子，人家会讲说，那发生车祸的这个机车事实上几率非常高，对不对？但是你不会把整个台湾的财产、性命放在一辆摩托车上，所以发生摩托车是 individual 发生，所以我们可以降低，我们可以容许这个 capacity 有很多的这个车祸产生，但是不太可能容许整个台湾就做一个台湾放在同一个机车上发生车祸产生。当然不是机车本身发生车祸以后，它可能还不是致命的。我想说，如果在飞机上用飞机这个做比喻是更清楚。所以你是把整个台湾的，因为台湾这么小，所以把整个台湾放在一个虽然它发生几率很低，但是发生几率以后，它的影响非常大。那这个 risk 本身其实是要看它的 impact、它的 consequence、它的后果。那台湾的边境条件是相当不允许我们做这个过程，这个也是要回答。对。那我们这里也不提其他在国家安全、在战争、在天然灾害整个产生源等这个产生，我们都不谈，因为你可能管理不良所产生的这个意外。好，那更有，这次事实上在乌克兰战争的时候，事实上核能发电厂就被当作是一个非常重要的战略地方被占领，对不对？它是个威胁。好，第四个，再生能源的问题并不等于我们今天当然面临到很多再生能源问题，但是再生能源问题，我们应该回过头来检讨我们再生能源的治理，比如在光电本身，我们应该怎么去改善，而不应该拿这个东西来当做说，所以我这边做不好，那所以我们就来推动核能。我甚至想，你再生能源你都治理不好，那你能够治理核能更复杂问题。同样的，台湾政府不管是哪一党。同样的，我们的技术官僚在面对这些问题的时候，同样这个社会在面对一个复杂的能源问题的时候，我们能够保证核能本身的这个治理问题会比再生能源更简单、更容易控制吗？更环顾刚刚讲的这个 constraint。第五个是长期路线的选择，这个我们要稍微我先跳过去。第六个，我在那个3周刊的访问里面，我就看到童董事长。他就讲，我们未来我们很多的公司需要 RE100，它是跟核能有什么关系？这边有 common sense 都知道 RE100并没有办法核能。那这样的一个 information 其实在 confuse， 在台湾未来整个在经济的发展里面，其实我们把核能当作是一个选项，在很多的知识是有问题。第七个，我想最后我就说，永和的意识形态来自哪里？我们要去思考它真正背后的经济利益的思维在哪里？它还是非常清楚一个 cost down。我们今天其实一直在讲，刚今天我们讲成本，其实就成本来讲还是很高的。可是我们绿能本身的成本，很多人讲说绿能成本很高。我们来看一下台湾的这是台电的公布啊，台湾的住宅用电是全世界第5低的，但它比较了30几个国家。这边30几个国家，台湾开发中国家跟已开发国家。那工业用电台湾是第8个，3.2块，第8个。我随便举一个例子，工业用电在新加坡是7.7块钱，7块钱，7.0块，这是2023，那台湾是3.2块。那当然你可以比较美国，美国是它 energy 它是属一定程度的，它有产生石油各方面，所以它的 energy 本身它的条件是不一样，但完全没有。能源产生的这几个国家，它市场都相当高。那更不谈到像波兰7点多啦，或者是奥地利啦这些国家更是多。那我们的住宅用电也是偏低，也是相当低。那在这个情况，我们每年最近不是预算的时候要2000亿，要补贴，所以这2000亿代表说，那 taxpayer 去补贴重要的用电，重要的用电，所以台湾的整个电的反应。事实上是等于是用 taxpayer 去补贴所造成的这个价格，那这个东西其实如果我们持续要保持这个价格的话，那我们就必须要付出其他的叫 external cost， 就是外部成本。这个外部成本有些是量化，有些是定性，有些是质化，包含社会的转型正义、能源的转型正义，包含我们真正的其他外部的这个 risk，整个政府，整个全民纳税的这个补贴等等等等。我想我简单大概提出这几点的关键问题，是不管有核或者是 或者是反核，都必须要去回答的关键问题，这样才公平。OK， 我就先
好，那我们谢谢林宇松教授。好，那我们接下来下一位语坛人是我们台湾气候行动网络研究中心赵家伟博士。
好，各位朋友大家好。我在这边的话，宇松老师有特别这个博士的演讲里面，他在更完整的在讨论这个技术后面的本质，他们也有很多的论述。那在这边的话，我也在跟大家再宣传一下，就是拉玛拉博士的那个新书，其实非常好看，里面其实谈到很多包含是核电业的这些游说策略，都有一些具体的人物。那我们在座如果也希望说现场或线上有那个出版社的朋友来讲的话，都可以来找我们去谈一下版权，因为我们希望能够把它翻译成中文，然后让台湾我们这几年来经历过很多跟那个核电有关的辩论里面，我们可以有个充足的知识，可以去讨论到这样的议题。那我们现在如果要讨论到这个议题的话，我们要我这边来讲的话，就是因为我们时间有限，我们就要谈一件很重要的事情，就是当我们现在看到有很多要重新要讲说那要核电才是台湾未来的时候，那我们就要去思考说，他们提出来的提案，所谓的核电的占比要在2050年的时候到30%这件事情来讲的话，它是做得到的吗？或者是如果是硬要做到的过程中来讲的话，它会付出什么样的代价？我觉得这边是我们在讨论到这个议题的时候，我觉得都必须要去严肃面对，甚至也要逼这些可能在针对这一题提出很多的所谓的这方面出的这些企业的领袖们，他们必须要去面对到这样的一个重点啊。因为我们如果要达到这个30%这样的占比来讲的话，那他们大概是核电的发电量，就是我们现在台湾一年的发电量大概会是2800亿度左右嘛。那如果我们是2050年，那现在还有个诱电成长趋势的一个设定，就是如果核电的占比要在2050年的时候占到30%的话，那当然核电的发电量要发到的都是1700亿度以上，1700亿度以上。那这是什么意思？就是我们炒了40年的核四，它一年顶多的发电量大概是200亿度。所以我们现在的状况来讲的话，就是说，那我们希望能够要想办法来重新是在接下来30年里面，现在26年里面，你要重新有一个8倍的这个核四的发电量，能够在台湾能够生成，这个事情到底可不可能做得到？当然的话，在很多的像是童先生，就是童世杰董事长他的一些言论里面，或者是有些核能专家里面的一些谈法里面，就说，那我们就是现有的4个厂址，那我就是各4个厂址里面都在各放4个大概是1700千瓦的这种就是1600千瓦的这种 EPR 直接放进去，所以这样子来讲的话，我们可能就可以达到这样的目标。但是这边大家也从拉玛拉博士刚才的分析里面，就是可以看到说，这些 EPR 的设置来讲的话，它的成本其实非常高昂的，而且我们要盖一个时间点，法国它要盖一个芬兰要盖一个 EPR 能够落实的话，它大概是将近花16年的时间才能够达成这样的一个目标。所以这个部分来讲的话，又会跟他们下一步主张说，那我们要把核电能够延役啊，要再去让核三能够延役，甚至核二都好，要重新把它找过来，然后甚至核四要重启来讲的话，很多点又有点不太一样。所以如果我们是要去思考出他们要怎么样才能够达到，如果真的是想要达到这个30%的这个目标来讲的话，其实他们的做法就是说，那你唯一有可能的做法是，你核二、核三你就全部都必须要延役，然后你还要想办法让核四再炒了，我们过去你炒40年，它要在未来的话，你要在用20年的时间里面，你要让它能够运转。而且除此之外还不够，你几乎是还要在全球，还要再盖33座的小型核能机组，才有可能达到你说所谓的核电占比要冲到30%这样的目标。所以这个部分来讲的话，都是他们在谈这些倡议的时候，他其实没有去实现、没有去谈的事情。他就回过头来去讲说，我们过去8年我们努力冲再生能源，然后只冲到说再生能源合计在2023的时候是大概风力跟光电加起来是6% 左右，但是在2020年的时候，它其实已经进到9%，今年度大概预计会到11、12% 左右。然后他讲说，过去8年里面证明说我们做不到再生能源去替代这个事情，但是却没有去面临到说，那我们像提到说核电占比有30%的话，在这些条件下到底有没有可能产生？ 而且这个部分来讲的话，我们大概算一算，就是那你总计要增加的整个装置容量大概是19 Giga 左右。那我们知道核电大国法国，它在未来二十几年里面，它的目标里面，他们谈出来的大核电计划，也就是要增加25 Giga 的一个装置容量。所以我们今天我们在台湾很多核电倡议者，他们提出来的事情是，台湾要走向跟法国一样等级的这种核电推动能力，才有可能达到我们的目标。所以这个部分来讲的话，他们的确是要去看说他们这样的一个倡议来讲，到底有没有实践的一个可能。那而且是我们要想说，这些事情来讲的话，它都不会是一个便宜的选项。那我们大家可以看到说，那现在很多主张说，那既有核电延役、既有核电运转成本大概是1.5块左右，好像看起来很便宜。但是如果你这些核电厂你要去延役的时候，你还是会有很多安全升级上面的需求，就像是我们看到的美国的 Double Canyon 这样的核电厂，它在断层带里面核电厂。加州被硬销它延役，但是后来发现到说，它延役的话，它1度电的成本几乎要增加到每度电大概要将近4块台币左右，所以它就不会是一个便宜的能源的选项。而且我们现在看到很多台湾的这些就科技业大佬，他们刚才在讲 SMR 嘛，他们就一直没有去面到说 SMR 来讲的话，它的成本，那大概我们教授已经呈现出来，它越小，其实单位价格越贵。所以我们看到说，在澳洲的那个研究机构 CICERO 里面，他们的分析就说，我澳洲如果要用 SMR 的话，它1度电的发电成本，2030年的时候1度电发电成本大概就会是7块台币以上，7块台币以上。所以我们现在看到的状况是，大概李聪老师特别提到说，我们现在工业电价，我们现在已经不断把它调整比较合理化，然后有些高用电量，他们的价格可能已经要逼近4块，然后他们就开始在那边吵，在那边争论，然后他们开始在争论，在讨论6块的离岸风力太贵了，我们要想办法调到5.5块以下。但是他们再去拥护这个 SMR 发展的时候，却没有去面对说 SMR 成本其实都是7块以上起跳，这样的一个落差来讲的话，我们都是看到说我们在这边其实是没有好好思考的。而且我们最后要去思考的事情是，我们面对到说接下来半年以上可能都会有跟这个核电的一些争论的时候。就像是说，我们希望我们的能够守护我们的预算能够妥善使用嘛。那我们现在的来讲的话，我们说我们这个所谓的要影响核电的这个要重新返回核电，要让核电占创造30%这个目标来讲的话，它到底会让全民会付出来多少成本？我刚才很快用一个就是刚刚教授里面提出来的这些新建成本的预算，大家去估了一下。它至少在新建成本上面，如果我们真的要增加大概19到20吉瓦的这个核电能力来讲的话，它其实就是10兆元的一个投资。那这10兆元投资对台湾来讲，我想说我们应该这10兆元应该我们有更好的用法，因为你在过往你讲说什么，我们就看到很多核电的拥护者，他都攻击离岸风力过往用了什么2兆元的一个骗局。但是我们现在这些倡议来讲的话，它这个10兆元确实会引领台湾来讲的话，会是浪费很多很珍贵的一个机会，很珍贵的去选择我们未来的机会，所以这都是我们现在面对到现在核电的一些很多相关论述的时候，我们必须要回过头去问说，你们这些的论点来讲话，不能够说就是因为我们过往在这个再生能源发展上面很多的副作用，然后就说那核电是一个解方，可以去解决这些事情。而是他们必须要去面对到说，那你到底这边这样的提案来讲话，这些事情你到底在谈的事情是的目标可行性真的高吗？然后你再的话，你这个成本来讲的话，是不是就是你保证你这边宣称的这些所谓的低年的一个成本？那你这边讲的这个 SMR 是不是它真的2035的时候就能够高度的商业化？这些事情来讲的话，他们也都是在讨论这些事情的时候，我们必须要从这几点里面去解释他们的一些相关论述，也去解释一些我们在看到的一些商业杂志里面针对到所谓的新核能技术的一些相关的报道。好，那我就先语谈来讲话，我就先谈到这边。
好，那我们谢谢我们2位语谈者哦。那我们接下来就是我们的提问讨论时间。那非常感谢各位的参与，不管是我们线上的参与的朋友，或者是现场的朋友，都有在 Slido 上提问。那我稍做一些整理提出。那我不只是请这个拉玛纳博士，我们2位呢，如果要回应的话，我们等一下也都。我就是直接进行一个这样子。好，那我是今天的主持人，绿色公民行动联盟的崔树新。那我们刚刚在听到，其实，在不管是博士的演讲或我们语坛的演讲，讲国际上怎么看待核能，还有我们台湾目前的 核能争议的现况，我们都可以听到几个问题。在这个气候变迁的危机之下，我们知道最重要的是什么？就是时间，大家都很想要赶快的解决问题。那解决问题，我们就来谈谈各种能源的它的时间的问题是如何，还有我们要解决这个途径它的成本是如何。所以我们在现场朋友就有人在提问了，就是说刚刚我们在听说时间是个问题。那刚刚博士说，为什么这一步在所有的国家核电建设都遇到严重的延宕，比预期时间要多出很久呢？这个时间为什么它会来不及呢？那相对的，核电厂面临时间问题，这是跟能源是不是也面临同样的问题？但我们讲的不是指现在的这个太阳能或风力，因为它已经有点成熟了。但可能它在现实上，假设它未来越来越接近饱和啊，那但是新的能源，例如说海洋能或地热或者是氢能这些更新的能源，它是不是也需要很久和不可预测发展的时间？让跟核电如何比较？那这是时间的问题。那另外再谈成本的问题，就是成本的话，各种电力来源的成本，它到底是怎么样来谈的呢？因为我们大家谈成本的时候都有很多的争议，是整个生命周期的这种成本，还是只有建设营运的成本？这要怎么样去看待这个成本的问题？那同样的也是提到说，如果在盖核电需要这么高的成本，那这个成本去发展再生能源，它的效果要怎么去评估？例如说，它是要怎么类比或比较？例如说用容量因素、占地面积，或者是发电稳定的因素吗？这两个如何比较？这两种能源的成果是要如何去选择？那我们先就这个问题，先请我们的比谈者跟我们的讲者回答。谢谢。
Thank you. Excellent questions. The basic question about looking at the two parts. One is about the cost, and the other is about why there are these delays and whether the delays can be expected in the case of renewables as well. The cost figures that I mentioned in those graphs that I showed from Lazard Corporation and so on are what are called the levelized cost of energy calculations. So this is the total cost over the whole life cycle, the projected cost for the future cost, divided by the projected amounts of electricity that have been generated, discounted to a certain starting point. So in a sense, the unequal efficiency of conversion of the renewable plants and the nuclear plants, as well as the different how much of the time they are operating, is all taken into account in that. Now, the LCOE is not a perfect metric. There are questions that have to do with the reliability of the grid that I mentioned, but trying to calculate the cost of securing reliability is not the cost that is specific to any single source of power. It's a system level property. It is not to be assigned only to the renewables or only to the nuclear. Each of them will have to contribute something. Right? And the question you have to ask when you're talking about the reliability of the grid is, how do you optimize it overall? What is the cheapest way? And there are a large number of people who are doing modeling of this. And depending on what kind of assumptions you put about future costs will tell you what kind of answers you get. So there are some models which will say nuclear is going to be the cheapest, and I'm sure that in Taiwan too there may be some people who say that. But if you dig deeper and if you look into the models, what you will most likely find, and this is what I have seen from my experience in the United States and Canada, is that the models that posit nuclear power as a solution are making unrealistically low cost estimates for nuclear power. So they will assume something like $3,000 per kilowatt or something of that sort, whereas I showed you figures which are often in the $10,000, $15,000 per kilowatt range. So that's actually something which is central about it. But in general, the point I'm trying to make is that there is some uncertainty because, as I mentioned, we don't know what the cost of some future renewables-related technology, future storage technology, is going to be. But there is a lot of reason to be more optimistic about than about the kind of cost assumptions that are made about nuclear. Right? If you can think that nuclear is somehow going to lower in cost in 3,000 something or 15,000, $2,000 per kilowatt, you can be far more confident that renewables and storage will become cheaper simply because of their nature. And this has to do with the answer to the first question as well, which has to do with why so many reactors are delayed, and are there delays in renewables, in renewable projects and storage projects. And the answer is, of course, there are going to be delays in renewable projects and storage projects as well, but the nature of the delays are somewhat different. Renewable projects tend to be much smaller in size, so there's a much larger number of them. There's a variation in the spectrum of how long they take, how much they cost. Right? So the numbers that I mentioned from the Lazard for the renewables are averaging over hundreds of projects, whereas there's only one nuclear project in the United States that goes under all those figures. Right? And nuclear has, for historical reasons, been underestimated in cost and in fact, I can show you this, the results of one of those academic studies that show that 175 over 180 projects were more expensive than expected and took longer. And this is partly because a nuclear plant is a much more complicated enterprise. There are safety concerns which don't exist in the case of renewables, but also because nuclear proponents know that if you were to actually cost it at what is seen, the realistic numbers, nobody will agree to build those plants. So they are forced to make up sort of optimistic estimates, which are underestimating what the actual cost is going to be. And so there's the pattern also has to do with certain kinds of false assumptions which are baked into the system.
我也许简短用另外一个方式来看这些问题。说我们现在其实可以去做论述，在这个场合里面，什么比较便宜或什么比较贵。但是我们都知道，其实一个成本估算是非常复杂的，包含同样的成本在不同的法规条件之下，它就会不一样。在很早以前，甚至可以把轻量的这个核废料丢到海里面去，后来国际上说不行。本来蓝屿就是要这样做的，所以成本就往上升高。所以成本这件事情是强烈依赖你的整个国家或者是整个社会对这件事情的看法。好，那我要说的是说，其实今天尤其在公共治理的部分，一个好的政策是应该要有一个不同观点的这个专家群来做决定，提出这样的一个不是做决定，就是提出这样的一个知识出来。那这个才有办法去形成一个大家基于这样的一个公共知识可以做讨论的，然后做决策的这整个民主的过程。那我们目前我们把两件事情都混在一起，我们有气候变迁委员会副召集人童董事长接受专访，不断的讲核能很重要。他同时他是一个召集人，他代表他这些知识又充满了错误，充满了 bias。那这代表说，我们国家的治理在公共治理本身。它不仅没有建立适当的这个公共知识，形成一个专家控理体，在这个委员会底下来提供让政府做决策或让老百姓做决策，更是完全混淆了。你就作为一个核能推动者，跟作为一个公共我们事实上是一个公共政策本身的重要委员会的一个副召集人，这个在政治治理上，在公共治理上完全就有问题。那这个我看的情况越来越严重。如果这个政府真的要转弯，那你就大方的转弯，跟老百姓讲说，我们要转弯，因为1、2、3、4，以前的问题我们都解决了，而不是应该用这种方式让大风起来，整个社会开始陷入一种模糊。那这是我刚刚讲说，对成本这个问题，其实我们可以经由精算，就是我们可以找很多国际的或国内的专家来讲，政府本身有责任去把这件事情成本的事情说清楚，然后让社会来做决定。这个大概是我针对这个看法。
好，那我很快的跟大家讲一下，就是我们刚才讲到成本的部分的话，那可能大家要有几个基本概念是，我们其实刚才我们的再生能源里面来讲讲说光电其实最低的光电的收费率，目前最低的其实已经可以低到，在今年都已经低到是3.5块，它其实已经比我们的全球平均发电成本还很低，但这是一个大型光电大概的情形。但是大规模的大规模的物理光电来讲的话，其实也都是我们可以看到是3块，等于说是3.8块、3.9块左右的一个成本。所以这个部分来讲的话，我们想说， 我刚才提到跟那个核电比较是延役的这个成本来讲的话，跟从那个延役的从加州的经验来讲的话，跟延役的时候它的核电成本来讲的话都是差不多的，而且我们看到是整个趋势它是不断往下降，但是核电的成本来讲的话，它都是一个逆向的一个学习曲线。但另外一个部分就是我们来讲时间，那这边来讲给大家一个参考事情，就是我们大家有讲到光电、讲风电的时候，它是不稳定性，所以我们希望能够有个跟核电一样，可以好很稳定的一个低碳的能源。那我们就讲地热。那地热来讲的话，我们其实的有购费率里面大规模地热现在是5.2块左右，所以其实你会比这个小型核能还来的便宜。而且以我们这样地热的发展目标来讲的话，我们大概2033年的时候，地热的发展目标目前大概是1.7吉瓦或是2吉瓦，那再来呢是110度电。所以我们的逻辑就是，你花10年的时间，我们增加的地热这个110度所谓的稳定低碳的发电，这110度的电就是一个核是一个基础的发电量。但你看我们过去40年，我们这110度电是不会存在的，所以我们如果再从另外一个时间来看的话，的确我们这些再生能源发展也需要时间，但是从这个历史经验里面，从他自己经验来讲的话，它里面所需要的时间，来讲都还比我们在讲说这个核电的发展来讲可及性是很高的，因为我们说如果要达到那个我们讲说童杰先生讲到目标的话，就是我们要把芬兰他们用16年的时间才盖好的一个反应炉，我们台湾要每5年就盖一座，这个事情是我们大家是很难想象我们台湾是有可能做得到这样的一个状况。
好，那我们谢谢3位的回应了。那我们再接下来提一下观众的提问。那我们刚刚讲到成本的问题，那这边我们会有朋友在提问说，的确有可能新建新的传统的反应炉要耗时过久 ，SMR 也是只闻楼梯响，现在想买也未必买得到的。那大家就会想到回头再讨论所谓的核电厂延役。那目前台湾的立法院也正想要讨论核电厂延役的修法问题，所以想要请问说，如何确保运转已经超过40年的核电厂还要继续运转，它的安全是要怎么样的评估？国际上有没有案例或成本统计这样子？那它这样子的延役会符合它原本预期的效益吗？谢谢。
If you look at older plants, there are 2 things you have to If you look at older plants, there are 2 things you have to consider. First is that the rate of failures of equipment malfunctioning, breaking down, and so on, has a very standard pattern, which is usually called a bathtub curve. So when a nuclear reactor first starts operating, then the rate of failures is typically quite high because it's a new facility. The workers may not know exactly how to function it, etc., etc. There are things which the designers may have done which may not work the way it's expected, and so on. And then typically after some experience, the rate of failures comes down. Then eventually, after a period of time, the rate of failures start going up. And that's why it's called the bathtub curve. That's because of the aging. You have to remember that a nuclear reactor is a very difficult environment to operate in. It's they mentioned high pressures, high temperatures, lots of radioactivity, there's a lot of material damage, things of that sort. So, the longer you keep a nuclear reactor operating, the higher the risk of an accident. That's just a given fact. I'm not saying that it's so high or not, that's something which is difficult to objectively establish because of the reasons that I mentioned. But if you look at the last reactor, major reactor accident we've seen, which is Fukushima Daiichi, the first of the Daiichi 1 reactors was just over 40 years. It had just been extended when the failure happened. Right? So something to think about. The second is what is the cost of refurbishing one of these to replace some of these degraded parts and so on. We don't have a lot of data on this, but the example which I think is most pertinent for you here in Taiwan is what's happening in the United States, in California with the Diablo Canyon plant. So Diablo Canyon again was supposed to be shut down in 2024-25, but for various political reasons, its operations. The governor of the state, Gavin Newsom, has ordered that the plant be continued operating because he is concerned about the political risk of blackouts and so on and so forth, for which he promised a whole bunch of money from the state and from the federal government. The cost estimates for getting the reactor back into operation from the utility that is operating it, Pacific Gas and Electric, is about $8.3 billion. The cost estimate from independent sources, from NGOs and so on, is more than $12 billion. So that's a rough ballpark that you're talking about. So you can do the calculations for a particular reactor and figure out, is this cost really worth the extra cost? And in the case of California, there's a lot of analysis that shows that this is not worth it, and this is not a very wise decision. I just want to go back to one other minor point which I want to add to the question of discussion of cost from earlier that Professor mentioned, which was, there may be different opinions, but there are some factual numbers out there, and on that hopefully we are not going to have difference of opinion. So there is a clear cost estimate for building an EPR, and the best cost estimate today is what it is costing in the UK to build the Hinkley Point reactor. Okay? The Hinkley Point reactor, so the usual, another answer that you hear from nuclear opponents is that sometimes these costs are very high because this is the first time we are building a plant of this kind. So they call it first of a kind cost. And they will claim that the nth plant of a kind is going to be cheaper, right? Now the Hinkley Point reactor is after the experiences in Finland, in France, in China with building the EPRs. So it is no longer the first of a kind. And yet, the Hinkley Point is the most expensive of all of the EPRs, right? So that should be what we should assume is the minimum cost if you're going to build an EPR here in Taiwan. Okay? And on that, I think the number is quite clear, whether you choose to assume there's going to be 90% of it, or it is going to be 110% of it. That can be the variation of the opinion there.
因为时间关系，我们剩下最后的问题我就把它稍微融合一下。那我想先就是有趣的，就是剩下的问题其实是互有关联的。那一个问题就是说，大家有人想问说，我们是要如何跟这个核能支持者来辩论或进行事实查核的讨论？因为我们刚刚看到有很多的讯息，在媒体上或外电里面，它有可能是公关讯息，有可能是宣传讯息，它也有可能也有些是真实的讯息。那如何要去辨别？那想要问各位讲者的建议。那正好就是下面有人提问的，其实我觉得就是两个很好的例子。因为我们下面就有人提问说，听说目前台湾核市场里面挖一个超级深入、超级坚固的坑来放核废料，这是真的吗？技术上可不可行？对，这其实非常有意思哦。就核废料指的是真的不能随便挖一个大坑，现有核电厂的厂区，目前3位1、2、3、4应该都不是适合的地址。那这就是一个我们就是说我们在媒体上有看到这个讯息，但一般大众可能有点难分辨。那另外一个问题是，其实很多企业界人士主张要使用新核能，但是到底核融合跟 SMR 有什么不同？请问讲者对于核融合有什么看法？好，那也是請等一下我们3位一起重提。
Nuclear fusion. Okay. So nuclear fusion. There was a joke in the semiconductor industry, which, speaking Taiwan, so you know all about it. Most semiconductor chips are made of silicon. And there's another material that can be used called germanium. And for a very long time, they would say, germanium is the material of the future. And now we use silicon, in the future we're going to switch to germanium. And by the 1990s, in the semiconductor industry, the joke was, germanium is the material of the future, always has been, always will be. I think nuclear fusion is a little bit like that. But in nuclear fusion, there are some very serious challenges which they never talk about. Right? So there are 3 kinds of challenges in nuclear fusion. The first is that there is a physics challenge, which is, in order for using nuclear fusion, the process of nuclear fusion is well known. It's what actually powers us most of the time. except that the nuclear fusion reactions are happening in the sun, millions and millions of miles away. Right? That process, you want to do it on the Earth, and we actually know how to do that. That is what the basis of the hydrogen bombs. Right? So hydrogen bombs, the first time nuclear fusion was done on the Earth. The question is, can you actually control that process and use it to produce electricity? For that, you have to produce more energy than you put into the system. Right? That's the minimum condition. Right? That's a physics condition, as I would say. So far, we are very far from that. So in 2022, there was an announcement from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in the United States saying they had seen this fusion, blah, blah, blah. And you look at the numbers. So that particular process produced some, I don't know, 3.13 megawatts or something like that. And you know, the amount of energy that went into the pellet was about 2 megawatts, joules, megajoules or something of that sort. I don't know the numbers exactly, but it's a very slight increase in the amount of energy that was produced in the fusion process compared to what was put into the pellet. But what is put into the pellet is a very, very small fraction of all the energy that is required to produce those, to heat up those lasers and have the lasers fired, right? That factor is about a factor of 100, right? So actually, you put in a factor of more than 100 more energy than what is produced. Okay, so that you have to increase the efficiency of that by a factor of more than 100 for it to make sense as a physics process. Okay? But let's say they can do that. The way that fusion works today is as an experiment in a laboratory, where for a fraction of a second, you're producing more energy than you put in, okay? If it works. But for us to consider nuclear fusion as a way to generate power, to have us use it as electricity that's feasible on the Earth, in our societies, that power has to be produced on a continuous basis, right? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, etc., etc. We are very, very far from that, right? So for example, in the case of the nuclear fusion process that happened in Livermore, you have to replace that little pellet that was all the lasers fired on. Before that, you have to clean up all the mess that was created when the first pellet was fired. And then that pellet, the next pellet has to go to exactly the same position, and the thing has to be very clean. There's a lot of key steps. So in fact, they can maybe fire one of these per day, okay? But you have to fire this every second, multiple times every second, for it to actually be a source, right? So you can understand that there's another factor of tens of thousands of increase that has to be had. So that's what we might call an engineering challenge. There are also other challenges which have to do with the nature of the fuel that is there. So tritium is not something which you find in nature in adequate quantities. You have to figure out how to extract out tritium. There's a lot of other damage that happens to the surrounding materials. Those have to be fixed. So there's a lot of engineering challenges. Finally, even if you solve all of these things, there is no guarantee that it is going to be an economical way of generating power. Right? When we have far more cheaper ways right now, which are feasible today, and the climate crisis is upon us today, it is not, the climate crisis is not upon us 50 years from now. Right? So I don't think we can wait for nuclear fusion for any realistic policy to be.
我想很快的，就是有点科普。核融合事实上就是我们讲，一般来讲第一次产生核融合的，就是人类制造出来的氢弹，氢就代表说它是氢的同位素融合在一起，形成这个氦，然后再形成一个中子。简单讲，这是非常轻的两个这个原子或者是它或者我们讲说质子，它合在一起，它会产生很大能量，或者产生其他的。那核分裂是很重，它有一种非常不稳定的这个重的这个原子，然后它分裂成其他也是有这个辐射线的这个比较小的、比较轻的这个原子。那这个是可以的。那有一段时间，记不记得在去年年底的时候，有一段时间永和的人连小型的 SMR 跟核融合 都搞不清楚。后来大概被纠正，现在不敢再随便讲说我们要 SMI， 所以我们就举核融合的例子。对，那我只在反映出，其实这些的基本上知识，如果你今天有核的，基本上是有核分裂。刚刚讨论的都是在谈核分裂的这个 reactor。那核融合这个东西，如同刚刚讲的是 long way to go。我们刚刚在开始之前稍微聊一下，跟拉玛聊一下，是说如果这个在我们的孙子辈能够产生，我说如果孙子辈能够产生的话，我们都很高兴有这样的一个能力。这个细节技术细节我不讲。最后我想提一点就是说，因为我刚刚有提到为什么背后的 driving force 在偏核能的时候，希望比较便宜的核能的能源，这样的一个 driving force 其实都是相当的产业界，而且是制造业的推动。尤其是 cost down 这件事情，一直是台湾产业界没有办法升级的一个非常重要的这个致命伤。我们的人力的 cost down， 能源也是 cost down，cost down 我们每补2000亿，实际上一定程度就是在补贴。那人力本身的薪水，我们工作时间非常久，这个也是某种程度的这个 cost down。那在这个地方，我们成立了我们整个建立了台湾整个经济现在的所谓的 achievement。这个背后实际上也是 social 的代价在里面，经济整个个人的代价在里面。不要忘了，这个核能只是它其中的一个部分的 tool 的一个方式，希望去 maintain 维持我们现在的经济的 structure。那这个一直是台湾不只是核能问题，而且是台湾的整个经济发展当中，包括我们半导体业要去面对的问题。这两件事情连在一起，大家都可以理解这个背后的 driving force。那我们就要问我们自己，我们要选择这样的一个 society。我们要选择这样的一个经济模式持续下去，这是比较核能。但是你如果接受这样的一个东西 ，energy 一定有 cost down， 我们要用 mass production 这种方式，这种逻辑，那我们是不是这个才会以下的这个核能以下的问题？所以它不只是一个减碳的问题而已，它事实上是转弯，借由减碳这个 argument 来 support 我们现在的这个 operation mode， 我们的整个这个经济的 operation mode 的经济的运作模式。我大概简单提一下这一点。
然后跟你朋友们谈到这个核融合的问题的话，你就知道，讲就连那个支持核能作为一个减碳解放的国际能源总署都没有把核融合当成是在模拟2050年进入净土里面的一个可行技术选项，因为我们在所谓的技术准备度，你刚刚去 readiness level 来讲的话，核能来讲的话，它还是非常的就是核融合的部分还是在非常初期的阶段，所以在这个部分来讲的话，是他们在模拟的时候就没有把它纳入其中。然后另外一个，我们刚刚有提到说，它这个沟通跟讨论里面，我觉得蛮重要的事情就是，其实像刚才那个李聪老师有特别提到说，我们看到的财讯杂志在这一期除了那个可能专刊来讲的话，他们就有一个报道看起来非常专业，它就是比较4种新型的这种核能技术。这边里面有各式各样的优势啊，什么就是那个熔岩性反应度或什么之类的。但是我们其实在中间拉玛拉博士的那个演讲里面也都有特别提到说，这些所谓的新型的核能技术，第一个它也不是新的技术，而且是它过往来讲的话也是越替般啊。所以在这边来讲的话，我们就是怎么样在这样的一个新的这样媒体论述之下，我们可以借由这些的就是当马博士带来的这些新的资讯来讲的话，我们可以让这样大家对这些事情的理解能够更为平衡。我觉得这边就是今天我们办这场论坛里面非常重要的一个目的。
好的，那非常感谢我们今天的3位讲者，还有我们的与谈人哦。那我们今天时间就要论坛到此结束。我们在这边跟大家预告一下，像我们刚刚提到很重要的，不管是社会沟通，或者像我们说这甚至是科学教育、环境教育的一环，怎么样能够分辨正确的资讯，然后能够做出正确的判断。所以这也是我们组织成立很重要的一个目的，就是我们希望能够借由这样专业的讲座、专业的报告或专业的资讯，能够让更多的台湾社会大众所了解。所以我们今天扮演的论坛非常感谢3位的出席。那我们这影片也会在 YouTube 上留存，也欢迎大家能够帮我们分享出去。那我们之后会出这个文字稿，那我们也会放在网络上，在我们的网站里。那另外呢，跟大家预告一下，明天呢，我们即将会有2024年世界核能产业报告的中文摘要版的发布。那这个发布呢，是由我们组织跟这个写作报告的单位呢，我们已经合作了很多年了。我们持续呢每年都会发布这个最新的世界核能产业报告，就是为求大家能够从数据上 而不是从我们说不管是政治词汇还是投资术语都好，我们应该要真的从数据上来看待核能是否真的不行，核能现在产业目前的现况什么。所以在这份产业报告里面会有包括世界各国目前核电新建的数据，还有它产业的现况。那明天呢，我们也会邀请了这个拉玛纳博士还有洪保罗的老师，我们一起都会来做这份报告的解析，也欢迎大家能看我们的直播。好，谢谢大家，那这个今天结束，谢谢。